myself throughout this last 30 years has been that they disappeared from relatively pristine areas. So good habitat, and I'd go into like the top of Mount Dalrymple at Yungala, and I'd be surrounded by rainforests in all directions. I'd stand there with my group of people searching for these threatened frogs, and we'd go, how could a frog disappear from this beautiful habitat? We'd spent a day hiking to get there. And we searched really remote catchments and trying to find them. Of course, we never found them, or I'd be much more famous. You'd all have heard of me before. But anyway, this was the enigma. It was restricted to high altitude, and stream dwellers were most affected. So I started to think about, along with the people around the world, the scientists around the world, of what was causing these enigmatic declines. So we looked at all of the processes that affect frogs and many other species as well. Invasive species, of course, is important. This is primarily in Australia. This is introduced fish, so the salmonids in particular, the salmon, the trout, we call them trout, freshwater trout that have been introduced throughout the east coast of Australia. And they are particularly invasive, and of course they love to eat tadpoles for breakfast, lunch and dinner. So they're responsible for some of the declines, particularly further south. Overharvesting isn't something we need to worry about too much in Australia because Australians, for some strange reason, don't like to eat frog's legs. You can buy them in some restaurants. But who do you think is the biggest consumer of frog's legs in the world?
France.
France, wrong.
Australia.
Australia, no, we don't eat them.
China.
China will be getting up there for sure. The biggest consumer is US of A. They import hundreds of thousands of tons of frog's legs from Indonesia every year, far more than France, which I think is France imported something like 40, I don't know, it was either 40,000 tons a year, which doesn't sound like much, and the Americans were consuming something like 200,000 tons per year. Overharvesting is a big problem in some areas, but fortunately in Australia we have created a culture and we live in an educated society that won't allow us to consume frogs, so we're pretty safe. Habitat alteration, though, is the biggest killer of frogs and other wildlife throughout the world. And the Gold Coast is a fantastic example. Try and find a scrap of bush between here and Southport, where I live, where I've just come from the university, and you'll be hard-pressed to find any. A little bit on Burley Hill, but that's high forest, and there's no frog ponds really in that area. So habitat alteration is the biggest killer, particularly in the lowlands. Global climate change is something that you should all be well aware of, and it's in the media. For some strange reason, it's still being debated as to whether it's even real or not. And we have to make a decision. Do we act now, assuming that it is happening, or do we just throw our hands up in the air and say, oh no, it's not going to happen? It's not really a decision we can make, is it? If we do something now, we can mitigate it. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant. The point is, we only have this option now to do something. The best analogy I have for the cynics of global climate change is for those of you who still smoke cigarettes and you think that smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. It took humans 30 years to decide that there was a strong causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And now everybody accepts it. We see it written on our cigarette packets before we open them. So it's now a phenomenon that's well accepted. But global climate change is going to be the same. It's going to take 30 years for the general populace to go, wow, it really is much colder this winter. Wow, we have had unusual storms, and this is completely abnormal. So, hopefully you will keep in tune with that, and you'll be the first to be educated rather than the last. Contaminants are another big impact on frogs, particularly pesticides and herbicides. Atrazine has been strongly linked to problems of gender in frogs, where males produce ovaries instead of testes, and there are all sorts of internal problems associated with that. Now, these changes in things like estrogen levels have also been linked to humans as well, and you need to be probably more concerned, or as concerned at least, as the frogs that are out in the forest.
What is atrazine? What is it?
Atrazine is a herbicide. It's a herbicide, but it affects the hormonal production of hormones in frogs and also humans. Of course, it hasn't been proven to be linked to humans, so they still use it widely throughout the world. Emerging infectious disease is a big killer, and particularly in the high altitude populations. So all of these frogs that disappeared in high altitude areas, the enigmatic or unexplained declines, have been generally often linked with this chytridiomycosis. Chytridiomycosis is the name of the disease. The disease is caused by a fungal pathogen called chytrid, a chytrid fungus. It's the only fungus that is in the world that is known to affect vertebrates and kill them, but unfortunately for us, it doesn't affect mammals or lizards or birds, but is devastating to frogs. So we have a lot of species affected by that. The worst thing, of course, is that all of these things are impacting on many species of frogs at the same time. So what we call the synergy or the synergistic effect is when you have all of these things hammering your frogs, pushing them to extinction at all levels. No matter whether they're high altitude, low altitude, or where they are in the world, they're being hammered by numerous of these threats or these causes of declines. Some of the initial work I did was try to find out who was declining, because in some places you would find streams where species have disappeared but others are still there. So I was particularly interested in that, and I was looking at what are the life history characteristics of species that are declining. Generally they have an aquatic life history stage and small clutch size, and also our species resistance appears to vary among species. No surprise there. You'll know that some of you individuals in this room will be resistant to a common flu, whereas others will not, and you'll be susceptible to it. That kind of variation you see within species. Among species, we're finding huge differences in susceptibility to chytridiomycosis and the fungal pathogen. All frogs have chemicals on their backs and on their skin to protect themselves from disease, just like you do. So whenever a zoospore of chytrid lands on a frog's back or anywhere on a frog, it should be attacked straight away by chemicals on the skin. Some frogs have really good chemicals that kill them straight away, and other frogs do not. So the species, of course, that don't have those antibodies or those chemicals to protect the skin are more susceptible. So we're finding differences in species in their resistance to that disease. The high altitude one's always been interesting. Why species at high altitude have been more hammered by chytrid, we still don't understand, and it's something that I'm working on, along with many scientists around the world. And small geographic range is also linked to declining species. The trick, though, is that these two, the small clutch size and restricted geographic range, are very strongly linked. So the frogs that have disappeared in Australia have less than 100 eggs per clutch. Most frogs in Australia, particularly the frog you might commonly know in southeast Queensland, the striped marsh frog, has about 3,000 eggs per clutch per female. And of course we all know the beautiful cane-toed, remarkable frog has up to 16,000 eggs per female in one clutch. So we're talking about the species with less than 50 eggs per clutch are the ones that are disappearing. The species with high fecundity that produce lots of offspring appear to be able to cope with chytridiomycosis. And that may be from active selection of those individuals that can survive with it, and the ones that die are quickly disappearing from the gene pool. And so we see good old Charles Darwin natural selection at work very quickly. But what's actually causing it is going to be these things like increased UVB radiation, increased climate temperatures, the raising of the cloud forest that we're seeing in high altitude rainforests around the world. So the mist forest that used to be there, the mist that was in the forest at high altitudes in the wet tropics is slowly disappearing, and the mountaintops are drying up, literally drying up. That, along with pesticides and herbicides and global warming, all influencing our frogs, which cause other effects, and the primary one here is immunodepression. So we have frogs that may have been resistant to this fungal pathogen but are no longer resistant because their immune system is depressed from these other pressures. This is where we are seeing these sorts of things in humans as well. And then of course the fungal pathogen comes in and wipes them out. So, in Australia we've now got 7 species considered extinct, and the declines are continuing. This is the corroboree frog from the southern Alps, the Kosciuszko region of Australia, what we call Alps. Anyone from anywhere else in the world would think they're little hills. But nevertheless, at the top of the Australian Alps we do see many declines, and this frog has been severely hammered. It used to be widespread throughout the Alps, and now it's known from a couple of ponds, where it's just hanging in with a couple of calling individuals. And so a large